thing about love is that when two people love each other, it becomes hard to tell where one of them begins and where the other one ends. It's like the two people become one. And so when a relationship ends, there is a feeling that something of yourself is being ripped away. There's a whole mess of feelings around a breakup. Anger, fear, sadness, and confusion, but most of all, it's a feeling that something which was once a part of you is gone. And even worse, it left on purpose because it didn't want you anymore. It's the gut punch, isn't it? It's not just the absence, but the rejection that's stitched into it. You're left holding this jagged piece of yourself, wondering how it could have fit so perfectly with someone else one day and feels so useless the next. It's like you've been rewritten without your permission, have a story that doesn't know how to finish itself. You replay the moments in your head, trying to spot where the seam started splitting, as if finding the exact crack could make it hurt less. But the reality is, it's not a puzzle you can solve. Love blurs all the lines, and when it's over, you're stuck redrawing boundaries you didn't even know you'd lost, figuring out what's yours again and what was only ever theirs. That redrawing, it's messy, clumsy work. You fumble through days where their absence echoes louder than their presence ever did, tripping over habits you built together, like reaching for a coffee mug they always used, or hearing a song that was yours. It's not just losing them, it's losing the version of yourself that existed with them. The one who laughed at their dumb jokes, who knew their silence is better than your own. You're mad at them for leaving, mad at yourself for caring, and yet somehow still hoping they'll miss you too. It's a tangle of wanting to let go and wanting to hold on, all while trying to remember who you were before they showed up and redrew your edges. But why does it cut so deep? At its core, it's because love isn't just a feeling, it's a binding of sorts. We're wired to connect, to lean into others, to let them shape us. It's not some poetic fluke, it's baked into us, down to the way our brains light up when we're seen, when we're held or understood. When you love someone, you don't just share moments, you trade pieces of yourselves. Your rhythms sync, your guards drop, and you build something that feels like it's bigger than either of you. That's why the end feels like a theft, because it is. You've poured yourself into this shared space, and when they walk away, they take chunks of you with them, not because they're cruel or anything, but because that's what love does. It merges, it overlaps, it leaves you tangled. We're built to crave that closeness, so when it's gone, it's not just a person you mourn, it's the part of you that only existed in that overlap. The part that doesn't know how to stand alone anymore. That fundamental tangling, it's why the aftermath feels so unmooring. We're not just losing a partner, we're losing a mirror, a rhythm, a piece of how we've learned to navigate the world. It's biological, sure. Our systems crave the stability of connection, the dopamine hit of being wanted, but it's so much more than that. It's existential. Love lets us co-create a little universe, a private language of glances and habits, and when it collapses, you're not just grieving them, you're grieving the collapse of that world. That's why you can't just move on like flipping a page. You're not the same person who started writing the story. You've been stretched, reshaped, and now you're left with this surplus of self that doesn't fit anywhere yet. It's a violence of sorts, how love rewires you so completely that its absence feels like a betrayal of your own instincts, because that part of you that trusted, that merged, doesn't understand why it's suddenly so obsolete. And so it begins the slow, aching crawl of recovery, a slog through days that feels too heavy, too hollow to bear. It's not a straight line or a grand redemption arc. It's more like picking through the rubble of that lost universe, hands trembling, unsure what's worth keeping. You wake to mornings that sting with their silence, the space beside you a cold reminder of what's been carved away. Every step feels like a betrayal of what was, eating alone, laughing at something small, daring to want again, because how can you rebuild when the foundation's gone? The heart drags at its feet, stubborn and bruised, clinging to the ache like it's the last thread tying you to them. You tell yourself you'll heal, but the words taste like ash. Time doesn't mend so much as it dulls, sanding down the edges of a wound that never quite closes. You learn to carry it, this tender, leaden thing, less a recovery than a resignation, sort of truce with a self that's forever marked by their leaving. Not too long ago, somebody asked me, why do you think manipulative people are manipulative? And as a self-proclaimed manipulative, I figured I should give my 2 cents on the subject. Generally, it's insecurity, I think. Fear of being left or of not having control over a situation. Sometimes even a fear of not having control over people. I think most likely it's an issue of not having been taught how to be in a healthy and loving relationship. That or they've been hurt, and the manipulative tendencies are merely a result of an attempt to avoid that past pain. It's a messy knot to untangle, really. Insecurity is a big driver, like a puppeteer pulling strings because they're scared the show won't go on without their grip. You see it in people who never really had a solid example of trust or mutual respect to lean on. They've either grown up watching power plays instead of love, or they've been burned so badly that manipulation feels like a shield. It's not always malice, though. That's where it gets tricky. Sometimes it's just survival, a warped way of keeping the world from crumbling around them. But then there's the flip side. Some People manipulate because it works. They've tasted that payoff, control, attention, whatever, and it's a habit that sticks. Either way, it's a hell of a lot easier to twist someone's arm than to risk being vulnerable and hope they stick around on their own. And vulnerability, that's the real problem, isn't it? Most manipulators I've known, or hell, even been at times, would rather chew glass than let someone see them raw. As the manipulator they are, and it's like handing over a loaded gun and trusting they won't pull the trigger once they see you for who you are. For a lot of them, that trust got shattered early, maybe by a parent who bailed on them, a friend who stabbed them in the back, or a lover who turned cold, so they learned to rig the game instead. Keep everyone guessing, keep the upper hand. It's exhausting, though. I mean, you can see it in their eyes sometimes, this wanting to drop the act, but they don't know how to stop. Or worse, they don't think they can afford to. Because if you build your whole life on controlling the narrative, letting go feels like jumping out of a fucking plane without a parachute. And who's there to catch you when you've spent years pushing people away? I think that's the paradox, though. Pushing people away while desperately needing them close. It's like they're stuck in this loop, craving connection, but terrified of what it means to let it happen naturally. So they pull their stupid fucking levers and spin webs thinking it's safer that way, but it's more of like a house of cards that's just waiting to fall. You can't force loyalty or love. Eventually people just catch on and they either leave or start playing their own games back. I've seen it turn into this ugly charade where no one's honest, just circling each other with fake smiles and hidden agendas. And the manipulator, they're left clutching at shadows, wondering why it's still not enough. Deep down, I bet most of them don't even like who they've become. It's just the only armor they've got. And that weight of the armor, you can only carry it so long before it starts eating you alive. I've watched manipulators unravel bit by bit when the mask slips and they're face to face with what they've built. Some double down, get nastier, cling harder to the game because admitting it's broken means admitting they're broken too. And others, they just collapse, like the strings they've been pulling snap, and they're left staring at the mess with no clue how to fix it. It's sad in a way. Sad because it's not like they woke up one day choosing to be this way. Life just taught them that trust is a gamble with lousy fucking odds, and they adapted. But adaptation's not the same as thriving. They're surviving, sure, but it's a hollow, empty kind of survival. One that leaves them isolated even when they're surrounded. It's hard not to feel for them, you know? Even as I sit here picking apart the why and how, I can't pretend I'm above it. I mean, hell, I've pulled strings too, more times than I'd like to admit. I'm so sorry. There's this panic that creeps in sometimes, like, if I don't nudge things just right, it'll all slip away. I've caught myself steering conversations, dropping half-truths, testing people's reactions not out of cruelty, but because letting go of that control feels like stepping off a cliff. And I get it. I get that tug of war inside. You want to be real, to just breathe and trust and love someone else, to meet you halfway. But there's still this voice whispering, what if they don't? What if they see you for who you are and run away? So you tighten your grip instead. It's a terribly lonely place to be, and I ache for anyone stuck there, myself included sometimes, because it's not living, not really. It's hiding, and the worst part is we're the ones holding the key, too scared to turn it, too tired to keep pretending, but still too human just to stop and say, enough. Let me be enough as I am. That fear, it twists love into something terrible. I've seen it, felt it myself too, how it morphs into this neurotic sort of dance where everyone's steps is calculated and every gesture is weighed. You start loving not with an open heart, but with the scoreboard. If I do this, will they stay? If I hold back here, will they chase me? It's not about giving anymore, it's about bartering. And I've caught myself there, dropping hints instead of speaking plain, testing loyalty instead of trusting it. It's tiring, this paranoid kind of love, because you're never just in it, you know? You're always watching from the outside, from the sidelines, analyzing their every move like it's a code to crack. Did they mean that pause? Are they pulling away? It's a spiral, damaging as all hell, because you end up resenting them for the cage you built yourself. And they feel it too. That invisible leash, even if they can't name it. I've watched relationships fray under that weight, mine included, where love stops being a refuge and turns into a fucking battlefield, all because I couldn't let go. I remember nights pacing in my own head, wondering if I'd pushed too hard or not enough. If I'd manipulated just the right amount to keep them close without tipping my hand. It's a sickness, really, this need to orchestrate everything instead of just feel. And it poisons the good moments too. You can't savor them because you're already bracing for the fallout. I've hurt so many people that way, not with this, but with this desperate sort of clawing. And I felt it turn back on me too. It's like you're both trapped in this unspoken game, tiptoeing around the truth until one of you snaps or just walks away, too tired to keep decoding this mess. But there is a certain magic in letting go, though. Hard as hell, but it's still there. It's still a possibility. I've tasted it in moments when I stopped gripping so fucking tight and just let the love sit raw and unscripted. It's sort of like unclenching a fist you didn't realize was balled up. Suddenly there's air again. I remember this one time. After months of processing a breakup, I just stopped. Didn't prod, didn't test, just sat with someone and let them be. No agenda. And it hit me how much lighter it felt not trying to steer every second. Healing is messy, sure. Never said it wasn't. I still catch myself sliding back, wanting to nudge things into place, but when I let love exist without my fingerprints all over it, it's realer, more alive. Scarier too, but that's because there's no safety net. And that's the point. You don't fix the neurotic mess by controlling more. You fix it by trusting, bit by bit, that it's okay to not know what's next. That they might stay or they might not, and you'll still be whole either way. Nature is a part of us, just as we are a part of nature. In many native cultures, there's this saying that we don't own the land, we belong to the land. The land provides for us and supports us. In many ways, we are the land. When I see a river, I also see the blood that flows through my body. When I see the forests that stretch on and on and on, I feel the breath of a greater thing, the same breath that fills lungs and sustains us. We come from nature. We are nature, and we will inevitably return to nature. But this also raises some questions, haunting yet beautiful ones. If we are the world, what do we make of our actions that scar it? When we poison rivers, are we poisoning our own veins? When we raise the forests, are we suffocating ourselves? The violence we inflict outward becomes a kind of self-wounding, a fracturing of the unity we share. Yet, amid nature's resilience, its capacity to heal, adapt, and persist suggests that we too might hold that potential within us. This grand sort of cycle of decay and renewal, the way a fallen tree feeds the soil for new growth in later years, hints at a larger truth. Even in our returning to nature, there's no true discernible end to it all, only transformation. To see ourselves as nature is to accept this dual truth that we are both the wound and the healer, the storm and the shelter. The river that is choked with refuse still flows, seeking its course. Just as we stumble toward meaning through our missteps, the forest, now diminished, reaches for the sun as we reach for understanding amid our shadows. Perhaps this is the deeper call of not just belonging to the land, but of becoming its stewards, its kin in the truest sense. To harm it is to also harm ourselves, yes, but to nurture it is to nurture the spark that keeps us alive. By letting go of a relentless chase for purpose, I found a strange kind of freedom. It's not about giving up or settling for mediocrity. It's more like stepping off a treadmill that's been running too fast for too long. When I stopped asking myself, why am I here every day, I started noticing what was actually in front of me, the small joys, the messy moments, the things I could do just because they felt right, not because they fit some grand narrative. I think there's something uniquely powerful in accepting that maybe life doesn't owe us some cosmic mission. Maybe it's enough to just be, to move through it with curiosity and kindness and let the meaning sneak up on us when we're not looking. For me, that shift didn't solve everything, but it quieted the noise long enough to hear myself think. And once that noise settled, I realized how much energy I'd been pouring into this abstract quest. Like I was trying to solve a puzzle that I didn't have all the pieces for. Letting go of this purpose obsession didn't mean I stopped caring or stopped striving. It just changed the lens. Instead of measuring every action against some elusive reason for being, I started asking simpler questions. Does this feel true to me right now? Does this bring something good to me or to someone else? It's less about finding a finish line of sorts and more about walking the path without constantly checking the map. I think that's where the real breakthroughs hid, not in the big dramatic revelations, but in the quiet moments when I wasn't trying so damn hard to justify my existence. It's kind of funny how the pressure to be something can drown out the fact that you already are. And that realization hit me like a slow dawn. It wasn't instant, but it grew brighter and more apparent over time. When I stopped treating life like a problem to be solved, I started seeing it more like a conversation, one that doesn't always need a punchline or a conclusion. I'd spent too long chasing this idea that purpose was some external thing I had to hunt down, like a trophy or a secret code, when maybe it was more about what I was already carrying, my quirks, my instincts, the way I show up for the people and the things that I love. Dropping the weight of why didn't erase the hard days or the doubts that I had, but it gave me the room to breathe through them. I could stumble, mess up, or just sit still, and it didn't feel like I was failing some cosmic test. In a way, it's sort of like I traded the search for purpose for a kind of trust. Not in any grand plan, but in the messy, imperfect flow of being alive. And of course, that trust didn't come easy. It's not like flipping a switch on and off. There were still some moments when the old habits crept back, whispering that I should be doing more, proving more, defining myself in some unshakable way. But the difference was I didn't let those whispers run the show anymore. I'd catch myself and think, okay, I don't need to solve this today or ever. It's almost like I gave myself permission to exist without a script, and that's when things started to transform in ways I hadn't expected. I found myself drawn to stuff I had overlooked before, conversations that didn't need a point, work that felt good in the doing, not just the outcome. It's not glamorous, and it doesn't tie up in neat bow, but there's a strength in it, I think. That shift in how I saw things, it rippled out. I stopped sizing up every choice like it had to fit some blueprint, and that let me take risks I wouldn't have had before. Not wild, reckless choices, but the kind that come from listening to what's tugging at you instead of overthinking it to death. I'd say yes to things that didn't make sense on paper or in theory, and no to the stuff that felt like it was just feeding that old need to justify myself. It's funny, once I quit trying to pin down a purpose, I stumbled into moments that felt more meaningful than anything I'd chased before. Like the time I spent an afternoon helping a friend move, not because it was noble or profound, but because it mattered to them. Or when I got lost in a book, not to learn some big lesson, but just to feel the words. It's almost like meaning stopped being this heavy, distant thing and became something I could touch. Small, real, and yet scattered all over the place if I just let it be. As those moments sort of piled up, something deeper started to click. A kind of unraveling that felt less like finding answers and more like seeing through the questions altogether. I'd been so caught up in this split, me versus the world, purpose versus emptiness, like they were opposites I had to bridge. But what if that divide was never real in the first place? A sort of non-dualistic stricture crept in there, not as some lofty philosophy, but as a hunch of sorts. Maybe there's no me separate from the living of it. No self to prop up with the purpose, no gap between what I am and what's happening. The friend I helped move, the book I got lost in, they weren't things I did to define myself. They were simply life unfolding. And I was part of the flow, not some director trying to steer it. It's like the edges between I and everything else started to blur. And instead of feeling lost, I felt held. Not by a reason, but by the whole damn dance of it. Purpose stopped being a thing to grasp because in that light there's no grasping needed. Just this, as it is. That blurring of edges. It wasn't just a fleeting thought. It started to settle into how I moved through the days. I'd catch myself in the middle of something particularly ordinary. Like washing dishes, watching the rain streak the window, and then there'd be this flicker in my brain. No me doing it, no separate thing being done, just the happening itself. Non-dualism wasn't about erasing myself, it was more like seeing that the self I'd been wrestling with was never solid to begin with, just a story I'd taped onto the raw pulse of being. Purpose, too, dissolved as a problem because what's the point of chasing something when there's no chaser, no chased? Life didn't need me to figure it out. It was just this. The water on my hands, the rain hitting the glass, all of it seamless, undivided, and alive. Okay, so take for example the way we often numb ourselves to the daily grind of life, scrolling endlessly, binge watching, brain rotting, or just accepting the status quo because it's easier than pushing back, retaliating. That complacency might feel good in the moment, like a break from the stress, but it's not health. It's avoidance. A healthy mindset to me means facing the mess head on, even when it hurts. It's the willingness to sit with the discomfort long enough to figure out what's wrong and what can be done about it. Growth doesn't come from pretending that everything's fine. It comes from wrestling with the ugly parts of yourself, the contradictions, the things we'd rather ignore. And yeah, that can hurt like hell. I'm not gonna lie, but the alternative, stagnation, a slow slide into a life that's just tolerable instead of alive. So, sanity, health, whatever the fuck you want to call it, it's not about avoiding pain or emotionality. It's about choosing the right kind of pain, the right kind of emotion, the kind that wakes you up and keeps you sharp. And that's where I think the real challenge lies, distinguishing between the pain that builds you up and the pain that just destroys you. It's not like every struggle is noble or every ache is a sign of progress. Sometimes we're just beating our heads against the same wall, calling it resilience when it's really just stubbornness. A healthy mindset has to include the guts to know when to let go, too. When to stop rationalizing a fight that's not worth having. But even that decision, that clarity can cut deep. It's painful to admit that you've been wrong or that something you've clung to isn't serving you anymore. Yet, that's the flip side of staying awake to the world. You don't just call out all the external bullshit, you've got to face your own. It's a constant recalibration of sorts, a kind of mental hygiene that's messy and unglamorous. You're not aiming for some blissful, untouched state. You're aiming for a life where you can look at the chaos, into it, yours and everyone else's, and still sort of make sense of it. It's what keeps you moving forward even when the steps feel really fucking heavy. So, in a way, this whole idea of mental health ties into something bigger. How we live, not just how we think. If clarity's the goal, then it's not enough to sit in your own head and sort things out. You've got to look at what's around you too, the systems, the habits, the people you let shape your days. The healthy mindset doesn't float above all that. It's entirely wrapped up in it. Take the way we shrug off injustice because that's just how it is. That's not peace, that's surrender. And it eats at you, even if you don't feel it right away. Staying sane means refusing to let that slide, even when it's tiring to care. It's choosing to feel the weight of what's wrong. Not because you're a masochist, but because you know that weight can push you to act, to change something, even if it's small. The pain of awareness isn't a dead end, it's fuel. But here's the thing, you've got to keep it in check or it'll burn you out. That's the tightrope, carrying enough to stay human, but not so much that you collapse under it. And that balance, it's not some static thing you achieve and then coast on. It's more of like a moving target, shifting with every new mess life throws at you. One day you're steady, seeing the flaws in the world and your place in it with a kind of calm resolve. The next you're totally reeling, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what's broken, your own limits included. A healthy mindset doesn't mean you've got it all figured out. It means you're willing to keep adjusting, keep recalibrating, even when you're tired of the effort. It's like tending a fire. Too little attention and it dies out. Too much and it consumes everything. So you poke at it. Add fuel when it's fading. Pull back when it's raging. That's what clarity demands, constant vigilance. Not just over what's out there, but over how you're handling it inside. And yeah, that can feel relentless. There's no finish line where you can say, okay, I'm sane now. I'm healthy. I'm done. Instead, it's the rhythm you build, a habit of questioning, feeling, acting, and then stepping back to breathe again. The pain's still there, woven into it, but it's not the enemy. It's the signal, the pulse that reminds you that you're still alive, still in the game, still capable of cutting through the awful noise to find something real. Now, think about that in the context of something like Team Fortress 2, a game that's chaotic, absurd, and relentless in its own way. You drop into a match and it's all noise, rockets flying, sentries beeping, spies backstabbing, medics screaming for help. It's a mess, but there's a strange kind of clarity you can find in it if you're paying attention. A healthy mindset in TF2 isn't about never dying or always topping the scoreboard. That's the painless illusion some chase. It's about reading the chaos, knowing when to bomb as soldier, when to flank as scout, or when to just bail because the point's lost. The pain of getting gibbed by some random crit or outsmarted by a trick stab isn't a failure. It's feedback. It stings, sure, but it also sharpens you. You respawn, change your loadout, change class, and go again. That's the tie-in. Just like life, TF2 punishes complacency. Sit too long on a comfortable perch as sniper, and a spy will remind you to stay awake. Ignore your team's medic, and the whole push falls apart. The game's a microcosm of that mental struggle, caring enough to play smart to feel the sting of a loss, but not so much that you rage quit over a bad round. Health here is staying in the fight, learning from the hits, and finding joy in the madness.